Of this screencast is to read aloud Chapter 6, The Land Changes Hands, pages 99 to 101, and to get you set up on some questions. And the reading is about the expanding nation and how people were moving west and how Minnesota was part of that western expansion. It also talks about how the native people living on the land in Minnesota and elsewhere were treated when westward expansion began. So, generally, a good reading strategy, especially when you have to answer questions, is to read the questions before you even start the reading. Gets us ready and kind of wraps our heads around what we're going to read. So, reading purpose 1, an introduction to The Land Changes Hands. And this is part 3 because you've already done kind of an overview of the chapter and a timeline. And A New Nation Grows is the title of what we're going to be reading. So read the introduction and A New Nation Grows, pages 99 through 101, and that's in the Northern Lights textbook. And then respond to the questions below. Notice it doesn't say you need to use complete sentences, you just want to use complete thoughts. Our first question, what motivated the U.S. government to make treaties with the American Indian nations? So, why was the U.S. government making treaties with Native Americans? What was their purpose? What was their reasoning behind that? The reading's going to answer that. Number 2, you're going to have to do some critical or deep thinking here and make an inference. What did the U.S. government consider American Indian nations? You see that they considered them nations, which is interesting, and the reading will discuss this more. Why did the U.S. government do this? Here's where you need to make the inference, is why did the U.S. government consider Native American tribes nations or separate nations? Number 3, how was the balance of power between the U.S. government and American Indian nations unequal? So we're going to see that there's an imbalance there of power. Who had more power, who had less? Finally, how did the imbalance of power impact the making of treaties? We're going to see that because one group had more power, did the other group really have a choice when a treaty was made? Did they just have to simply accept the terms of the treaty? So we'll come back to this at the end after we're done reading. So, the reading starts here, and this shows on July 23rd. So I'm going to use path here a little bit, look at headings, look at titles, and look at pictures. On July 23rd, 1851, the U.S. government and the Dakota signed a land treaty at Traverse des Sioux on the Minnesota River, and this is a painting of that. You can see the treaty being signed here, Native people as well as government officials. Here's the title, The Land Changes Hands. I'm wondering who had it first and who had it second. Here's the terms that you've already discussed. These are probably some questions that we're going to be answering. It looks like we're going to get a quick synopsis of what was maybe going on in Minnesota or what was going on in the nation for 150 years to kind of get us up to speed. And then we have A New Nation Grows. And along with this New Nation Grows, so the U.S. is growing, you have westward expansion and treaty, two terms you're familiar with because you've already define them. We have a picture of people moving west. Looks pretty laborious and challenging. And then the reading ends here at Ojibwe and Dakota and what is now Minnesota. And then the first land deal will be another topic. So we end the reading here. If you are choosing to read on your own, you can start that now. So you can pause this and you'll be starting here with The Land Changes Hands and reading this introduction and then moving into the body text on the next page. So you can pause now and do that if you're reading on your own. If you're reading along with me, we will start the reading now. The Land Changes Hands. The United States was a young nation that was growing quickly and desired more land. During the mid-1800s, it acquired millions of acres of land from Minnesota's Dakota and Ojibwe. Land changed hands through a series of written agreements called treaties. Learn how life was changing in dramatic ways for those connected to the land. So this is interesting, connected to the land. The Dakota and Ojibwe people were connected to the land, and now it looks like they're giving it up through treaties. We're going to find out why and how. Heading: for nearly 150 years. For nearly 150 years, European fur traders and travelers had come and gone from the land we now call Minnesota. Most of them were not interested in changing the ways of the Dakota and Ojibwe or in owning the land. The traders and their employers, the big fur trading companies from France and Great Britain, were mainly concerned with making a profit. So, for 150 years, the Dakota and Ojibwe were business partners, and the businesses that were coming over from Europe were interested in making a profit and trading for fur. Fur trading companies, though, were not the only ones to see North America as a source of profit. In addition to animal furs, North America was also full of other natural resources. Timber, tobacco, and food were valuable back in Europe as well. At different times in the 1700s, France, Britain, and Spain had all claimed they owned these natural resources and controlled trade with the American Indians. Sometimes European countries fought wars over who would control North America. Other times they made agreements to sell their claim over a section of land to another country. And we've already talked a little bit about this with Manifest Destiny, and seeing that a lot of times European nations were fighting over the land in North America, and it changed hands quite a few times. But the big kind of elephant in the room is that this land was not theirs to trade. It belonged to the native people, who often were not consulted when these trades were made, like the Louisiana Purchase. I don't think Thomas Jefferson checked in with the hundreds of tribes in that region before he made that purchase, or Napoleon made the sale. These arguments over who controlled North America affected American Indian nations such as the Ojibwe and Dakota. At first, they traded with the French, then the British. Beginning in the early 1800s, they were no longer trading with Europeans. They now were dealing with a new nation, the United States, whose citizens were called Americans. Since their families had mostly come from Europe, they were European Americans. So now, Ojibwe, Dakota, and other American Indian nations are no longer dealing with Britain and France and Spain, but now they're dealing with the United States. And we know that from what we've talked about in the past, that the United States is going to treat Native people a little differently. A new nation grows. In 1783, the United States won independence from Great Britain in the Revolutionary War. Soon after, the new nation looked to expand or grow to the west. As a result of winning the war, the United States claimed control of land previously claimed by Great Britain. This included much of the land between the original 13 colonies and the Mississippi River. Britain controlled much of Canada, and France and Spain still claimed ownership of land in Florida and west of the Mississippi River. In reality, however, this land belonged to the hundreds of American Indian nations that had lived there for centuries. If the United States wanted to expand, it would have to acquire land from those American Indian nations. In the early 1800s, thousands of European American settlers were so eager to go west that they moved into lands still belonging to American Indian nations. The U.S. government supported this westward expansion by acquiring land from those groups. Sometimes the United States made written agreements called treaties with the American Indian nations to buy land for cash and goods. The making of treaties was, and still is today, a familiar practice between sovereign or self-ruling nations. So, we're learning that The United States is expanding west. They need to make treaties with native groups in order to acquire the land that that European Americans are already moving into. So what's interesting here is, well, why are they making treaties with people that already live on the land and have for centuries? Aren't Native Americans Americans? So this is a question I'm asking myself. The treaties between American Indian nations and the United States were complicated. However, because the balance of power was not equal, both sides knew that the United States was more powerful. It had more money, more people, and more military power than individual American Indian nations. As a result, most treaties favored the U.S. government at the expense of the American Indian nations. So there was an imbalance of power. The U.S. government had more power because it had more people, more military might, and it had more money, which at the time was able to buy things or to trade with. Several times, rather than accept an unfair deal, American Indians chose to fight for their land. The United States responded by using its power to force them to sign agreements anyway. The United States did not always live up to the commitments it made in these legal agreements. So we see that some native groups decided, we don't like the deal that the treaty is stating, so we're going to fight back. And the U.S. government would use that military might to force them to sign it. And then even after having a group sign a treaty, a lot of times the United States government did not live up to the commitment they made. As westward expansion continued into the early 1800s, the U.S. government began turning its attention to lands west of the Mississippi River. In 1803, France sold the United States the rights to more than 900,000 acres of land west of the Mississippi River. This included land controlled by the Ojibwe and Dakota and what is now Minnesota. So here is where you're ending the reading. And just to sum this up, we learned the Louisiana Purchase is made, and that is a lot of land in Minnesota was acquired through the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, and they want to explore and purchase that land west of the Mississippi River, and that included lands that the Ojibwe and Dakota lived on. So, now that we've ended the reading, you want to turn your attention to answering these questions. And I'm going to help you a little bit. And you can pause and answer after I've read it and given you maybe a little bit of help. What motivated the U.S. government to make treaties with American Indian nations? Well, hint, they no longer wanted furs. They wanted something else. Number 2, you are going to have to do some critical or deep thinking here and make an inference. What did the U.S. government consider American Indian nations? Well, I underline the word nations here. Did the U.S. government consider American Indians Americans or something else? And then, if they did consider them something else, why did the U.S. government do this? What did it allow them to do? How was the balance of power between the U.S. government and American Indian nations unequal? Well, we learned that there was an imbalance of power. One group had more, one group had less. And when we get to number 4, how did the imbalance of power impact making of treaties? We're going to learn that because of this imbalance, the U.S. government was able to force groups, perhaps, into signing a treaty, even one that was not fair. So go ahead and respond to these questions. This ends the screencast.